OGB Media Group Let's Talk Transition podcasts. I'm Murray Malhewish, the founder of Anna Consulting. We help organisations bring offshore technologies and services to market and provide interim project management to the offshore wind industry. I'm really delighted to have with me today Dan McGrial, Chief Executive Officer of Renewable UK. Dan, can you please introduce yourself and Renewable UK?
Good morning, Murray, and first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast, and really looking forward to chatting about energy transition with you. First of all, Renewable UK is a membership organisation born out of the wind industry, dating back to the 70s, believe it or not. Started as the British Wind Energy Association, and then diversified through time. And over the last decade, we've been called Renewable UK. We represent about 450 member companies. We're growing, obviously, because of the industry's growing, but also growing because we're increasing our interest in activities beyond wind into obviously very much in tidal, but also now in technologies such as green hydrogen. And the companies we represent are really right across the whole gamut of the industry. So from the largest developers, big companies transitioning into renewables from oil and gas, for example, major developers right the way through the supply chain, the big manufacturers of turbines, of electrical equipment, the marine sector significantly, and the whole supply chain. One of our unique points as a trade body is that we have that representation of the supply chain very significantly. About half of our members are active supply chain companies, and it's also arguably one of the most exciting parts of the energy transition, that the potential growth of supply chain for UK companies. So we represent significantly in that area, and we're about 45 people in our UK now, and we continue to grow as a trade body. So yeah, we're right at the heart of the energy transition, and very much a privileged place to be, I think.
Great, 450 companies. That's an impressive footprint. Looking at the Renewable UK, I see that Renewable UK members are enabling a just transition to a net zero future. That sounds amazing. How do you define a just transition, Dan?
It's a good question, and I think to start off with, we're an industry very much at the heart of net zero. Social justice and climate justice are very closely linked. I think we can see at the moment the impact of the cost of living, and therefore helping reduce the cost of renewables, which has been very much part of the story so far, to now being the cheapest part of the electricity generation system, is a huge part of that aspect of just, because it means that the energy transition has to work for everybody in the end. And that means even the fuel poor, this can't be a transition which falls unnecessarily on those who can't afford it. So clearly, reducing the cost of renewables over the last decade has been a really important part of it. But we think about just transition in kind of three different factors. One is people, one is places, and one is planet. Right. So starting with people, it really is about jobs and creating opportunities. The industry grew initially from being subsidized. It's now practically not subsidized, and in many cases pays back to the consumer. But seeing jobs created out of this for people across the country is an important part. And we have, as an industry, set ourselves targets for apprenticeships, for diversity and inclusion, and for helping workers transition from other sectors, so notably the oil and gas sector, but not just the oil and gas sector. Clearly, the energy transition will impact on many incumbent industries, and therefore we want to make sure we create pathways for people to come out of those industries and into the wind industry, whether that's onshore, offshore, whether that's in technical roles, or whether it's in project management or engineering, or many of the supply side aspects of this industry. So that's really important on the people side of things. Then when we think about places, our industry has a really unique proposition in terms of helping rejuvenate local economies, in particular economies in coastal communities which have been perhaps declining, which have needed rejuvenation. So if we look at some of the great impacts we've had in places like Grimsby, which is now the biggest operations and maintenance hub in Europe for offshore wind. If you look at Hull, where I have a personal experience, which we might come on to later, where Siemens employ 1,000 people and are growing their factory there, where they manufacture blades, and seeing the impact of that on a community which has suffered from, let's say, industrial decline, is really important, and that matters a lot, I think, in the sense of a just transition. And then clearly planet. I said it in the opening to the question that we are very much an industry heart, with net zero at our core, but we also have to take account of the fact that we're not completely net zero. We have to start to pioneer in areas such as green steel. We have to pioneer in things like our marine activity and make sure we transition to zero emission vessels in the future. We have to make sure that blades on our turbines are recyclable, and that we're not creating problems for the future. So this kind of circular economy thinking is really important in the sector as we go forward. So, there are three categories around just transition that we work on, we track, and that we in the future will be producing more and more analysis on how our industry is performing against those criteria.
Yeah, it's great to hear. I think, especially as you say, the rejuvenation of these towns, it's something that you don't really consider connected with the offshore wind industry, particularly. But clearly there's a huge impact on them. That's amazing. And the fact that renewables are now the lowest cost generation in the UK, that's also, I think, a huge leap forward. Despite that, though, I think the industry's still got its detractors. And of course, the problem with wind, for example, is storage of the power. Do you think the industry's doing enough to solve that problem? And do you think the right incentive mechanisms are in place so that the right innovation and investment is being encouraged and rewarded?
Yeah. I mean, let's start with. I mean, it's one of those things that often makes me sort of chuckle a little bit. When the industry has its detractors and people say, "Well, the wind, sometimes doesn't blow." It's as if those pioneers behind the wind industry didn't know that. We are aware of the fact that wind is variable, and we know that the capacity of wind farms is always going to be dependent on the conditions, the weather conditions. The weather is predictable, however, it isn't necessarily controllable. So but I think the first point and where we need to start is where we've got to with wind is that the cost of generating a megawatt hour from an entirely new wind farm that we start building today and start producing electricity from in a few years' time is going to be a quarter of the cost of putting gas through a power station which was built 20 years ago. So that is the reality. Building new wind farms, it costs a quarter of that and half of the cost of a nuclear power station based on the prices for Hinkley Point C. So we're already at an incredibly low base. So it makes absolute sense to build an energy system which harnesses as many megawatt hours from wind and from solar, which is also at low cost, as possible. And I often say to people in those conversations in the pub, which you have from time to time, if you can't necessarily see it any other way, wouldn't it just be better if we could generate all of our electrical needs from nature? Isn't it just better? So let's take that on one side. But you have to recognise the fact that clearly there's need for storage, and we lobbied over a number of years to push for planning reforms to enable grid scale storage, which are now coming through. We're seeing an incredible pipeline of battery projects. I think, just last year, the pipeline of new grid scale battery projects was about 16 gigawatts. And this year it's 32 gigawatts, so doubled in a year. And our reports and analysis are available to sort of to explain that. But government is now have to look at how to stimulate investment in things like long duration storage, because clearly it's going to be windier in the winter than it is in the summer. And we have to think about how we transfer demand to match that as a little bit as well. But also the emergence of green hydrogen is now one of the key pillars in all of this. This offers the opportunity for storage over long term. It also gives us the opportunity to decarbonize sort of the hard to abate sectors, and essentially turbocharge net zero if we get a business model that works, and government is consulting on that at the moment. I think the final point I'd make is we are about to enter almost dauntingly into a period of major market reform. You know, there's been much talk about so-called REMA, review of electricity market arrangements. The last time we did something on this scale was electricity market reform, which came into force in 2014. But that started in 2008 and 2009. So it was a long-term project to really rethink how markets work. And we really now have to think about, one, how do you get cheap renewable power to consumers if it's the major part of the energy mix? And there's been much discussion about the fact that gas is the price setting fuel in the market. So that's something that is in people's minds. We have to work out how we unlock investment in and at scale that's needed for net zero, in terms of not just in renewable energy, but also in storage. And then how do we build the supply chains associated with all of those things, which is not only a challenge, but also an enormous opportunity. So, you know, we are working on all of these things. You can see, for example, last month or a couple of months ago, Vattenfall received funding from government to do a demonstration turbine fully integrated with green hydrogen generation. So, you know, generation of the hydrogen or production of the hydrogen very much in the turbine, which is a kind of a pioneering piece of research. We saw Scottish Power Renewables announce plans for a major green hydrogen production facility at Felixstowe. Ørsted doing something similar with their project, the Gigastack project in Grimsby. So there's a lot happening, and I think the industry clearly cares about this, wants to work on it, and sees it also as a huge opportunity. So I'm not underplaying the problem or the size of the challenge, but I also think it can be an overstated challenge, because we have the engineering, the capability, and the identified solutions that we need to just work through the cost reduction trajectory and start to deploy at scale, which is really the secret. And offshore wind proves this, the secret of getting it down to a competitive level.
Okay, that's yeah, some great points there. But I guess for me as well, offshore wind and renewables are about more than just carbon footprint and cost, because this year especially, I think we've all been focused on, I guess, energy security, especially for Western Europe, you know, with what's happened in Ukraine. Now, to have true energy security for Western Europe, for me, we as an industry have got to speed up the project cycle. But how do we do that, Dan?
So clearly, energy security has moved back up the priority list in many respects. The word trilemma has been used more in 2022 than perhaps many of us expected at the end of 2021. It was quite a fashionable thing to talk about a decade ago. But energy security clearly has been a significant issue, and our engagement with government, in particular, during the period immediately after the crisis emerged in the Ukraine, was very, very intensive. We proposed a plan to government to reduce dependence on gas within 5 years. This industry has always been about scaling up. It's very much in the DNA. So we know how to do it, and we think that we have the ability to deliver at scale. But clearly, the limitation has been up to now how fast you can develop and consent wind farms, and that's a limitation which is coming to really acute sight during the period. We met with the Prime Minister. We met with other senior ministers during the period after the invasion, and talking about how we speed up has been very much a key thing. And as a result, the Prime Minister has introduced an offshore wind champion and an offshore wind acceleration task force, which I vice chair with the Energy Minister. And we're really focused on the tools that we have available to us to really speed up in the short term, whether that's increasing the resourcing around the bodies that need to help consent wind farms, creating clearer guidance, speeding up the statutory processes on one side, moving to annual auctions, which is something that we lobbied for a long time, bearing in mind this year's auction, which has just released its results, is 3 years since the previous one, delayed partly due to COVID. But we have to really speed up that whole process, more regular leasing, more transparency about the roadmap. But I also think as we move towards the next phase of development of the industry, in particular, let's say maybe post 2030, we're going to be getting into a phase where not only are we consenting new wind farms, but we also start to think about decommissioning some of the first ones, repowering some of the bigger ones. So this is going to need, I think, a much more streamlined and dedicated regulatory framework for offshore wind as it becomes a key part of the UK's economic backdrop. At the moment, you have a scenario where all of this is regulated by different bodies, and I think in the future we may look to bring about a more streamlined approach, maybe similar to the model that's in place in the oil and gas industry. So these are the key things. I think on our side, in the industry side, we have to do more work to industrialize. We've got new emerging technologies like floating offshore wind, which is a great opportunity, but it needs to be industrialized and scaled up. And again, we know that these are challenges that we need to work on. We've got experience in this kind of scaling up process, but let's not underestimate the significant challenges that are there as well. So there's stuff to do on both sides, but the good thing is we're talking to each other, we're working together collaboratively between industry and government, and I think we have perhaps more than ever a consensus within all political parties and major sort of stakeholders that offshore wind is very much the key to the trilemma, be that on energy security, be it on cost reduction for people, or whether it's on sustainability.
Great, thanks. And how about onshore wind? Of course, onshore wind developments have been, few and far between for the last sort of 5 or 10 years. But can you see that changing, Dan?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's good news, and then there's still challenges around onshore wind. I mean, starting with the positives, we worked really hard to lobby government to reintroduce onshore wind into the CFD auctions, which for this year was the first time that that's happened, and it was a real success story of our engagement with government. I think governments see very clearly that not only is onshore wind incredibly low cost, and that's been played out in the recent CFD auction with prices, just close to £40 a megawatt hour, which is the long run, wholesale price of electricity. But also it's incredibly quick to build, and so when you've got a crisis of energy costs, one of the sustainable long-term solutions is to increase the amount of onshore wind. So 1.9 gigawatts of new onshore wind projects were brought through in this year's CFD auction. The government in the energy security strategy committed to keep that as the place, to keep that in place for the foreseeable future, so that that is a positive. And they also committed to work on producing guidance for repowering, which is going to be an important part of the onshore sector going forward. It makes absolute sense to increase capacity where there are already wind farms. So that's something we can do work on together with government. We do also think that the British energy security strategy was a bit of a missed opportunity for government in this. They didn't lift some of the frankly very difficult planning regulations. There's a very specific piece of planning law in England which all but prevents new onshore wind farms from being built, which basically says that any one person opposes an onshore wind farm, then basically it can't get consent. We wanted to see that removed and replaced with something much more measured. And clearly onshore wind farms in England will not be as significant as they are in Scotland or in Wales, where the conditions are not as favourable. But ultimately, there are places where it does make sense to build onshore wind farms, and there are lots of industrial companies that would like to put wind farms next to their factories, etc. And that is really difficult to do at the moment. But the government opened up a pathway for that, for a limited number of partnerships with communities who do support onshore wind, to explore how that can be done. And the final point on onshore wind is that, we've done a lot of polling in this area, and we see that communities that have onshore wind farms are incredibly positive about them. The polling says that, over 80% of people in general in the country are supportive. Conservative constituencies in particular are supportive. So in many respects, the government's position on this has been, quite paradoxical to their own electorate. But one of the reasons why people are positive is that these wind farms pay back significant community benefits, both financially and non-financially. One of the areas which we're increasingly exploring is local electricity discount schemes. So, in other words, offering people cheaper energy. And some companies out there like RES, Octopus have been pioneers in offering these schemes, and shown that there's huge community support where these programs happen. So we want to see more of that. We want to use the opportunity that came out of the energy security strategy for that, build on that in the future, and hopefully see more and more onshore wind reaching a target that we've set for the industry of 30 gigawatts across England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland by 2030.
Great. And if I can touch on wave and tidal power, Dan, because of course, those are very much renewable technologies as well. And as we all know, the moving sea is a massive potential power source, but no company seems to have managed to fully harness the potential yet. How do we change that, Dan?
Well, I think you look at the ingredients of success of other sectors like offshore wind. There is no doubt that the early stages of tidal developments in the UK have positioned the UK as a world leader. We have some of the best research facilities here, and some of the best demonstration projects across a multitude of different technology ideas. So we've created this basis of knowledge. And the secret is always about scalability and can you industrialize it? And the answer to both those questions is inevitably yes. These are systems that can be scaled, much like wind turbines. They can be manufactured in a serial production way. And really deployment and demonstration is the secret. And then we need to sort of move into scaling up. So there was some success in this auction. We already have the world's largest project in Maygen in the Pentland Firth. We have seen success in this auction. There's 3 new projects which will come online in 2025. And really that's the next step is, what can we do to industrialize, get bigger projects through? Because bigger projects really then start to show the lessons learned as to whether we can really get down the cost curve. I think, often there is a trade-off between sort of the predictability or the reliability of the technology versus the cost. And it may be that tidal power or wave power doesn't ever get down to the prices that wind power does or solar does, but it does offer a different benefit to the country, which is that the tide is predictable, and therefore we want to see bigger projects come through in future auctions, continued support. And if we get this right, it could open us up to major export opportunities, especially from Scotland, where much of this industry has been built up.
Yeah, great. And with the cost of wave power particularly in mind, I guess the one thing that always strikes me is that we should be seeing floating offshore wind farms and wave generation co-located, so sharing export cables to reduce cost. Do you think we'll get to that, or is that pie in the sky at the moment?
I don't think anything's pie in the sky at the moment. I think the floating wind farms in particular, and when we talk about convergence with other technologies, whether that's wave and tidal technologies and share and export cables, that's possibly one solution. And I don't think that's sort of pie in the sky at all. I think what we need to probably work through first and foremost is the cost reduction curve of floating wind, and see, because we have significant ambition in floating offshore wind. ScotWind has brought forward something like 14 gigawatts of projects, and they may even grow in size as well. But ultimately, there's a lot of work on industrialization of floating offshore wind to do. And we may also find that because of where these floating offshore wind projects are, it makes more sense to generate, rather than generate electricity, it would be to produce hydrogen or a combination of both. So I think the convergence of different business models of generation and storage, of general production of hydrogen, this will all start to be perhaps the next phase of development of renewables projects going forward, not just in floating scenarios, but also in onshore wind farms, where we may also see more storage, more hydrogen production, as actually we're already seeing with companies like Scottish Power Renewables thinking increasingly about their onshore wind farms as energy parks rather than simply a generation asset.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it'll be great to see where that goes. And Dan, you've mentioned Renewable UK's role in representing companies and in lobbying government, but if you don't mind me saying, Renewable UK is also responsible for producing some of the best events in our industry. Can you take us through some of them?
Well, yeah. First of all, thank you for the compliment, and I agree. But then wouldn't I? We've got a really fantastic, hardworking team that produce an events portfolio which is built on some really key cornerstones. Our global offshore wind event. We got about 4,000 people to our event this year in Manchester. That's in spite of the train strikes. It was incredibly successful, and I think a great example of the general optimism and the commitment that people have to the sector. It was also really a great place to see some of the emerging technology that the UK is working on. We've got some really cool technology emerging, and seeing how that is developing is a feature of that event. We also have our floating offshore wind event, which we do together with Scottish Renewables up in Aberdeen. So that's coming up in October, and I think that'll be a really important event this year, because we're building on the fact that we've got the first floating wind farms through the recent allocation round, and we've got more to come. And Renewable UK is also leading a floating wind task force together with government, both UK government, Scottish and Welsh governments, to really work out how do we industrialize this technology, how do we invest in the right infrastructure, grow the right port estate to be able to deploy floating offshore wind at scale, and also work out what technology we can be really excellent at in the UK, so that we can really use what is already our global market leadership in this sector to sort of catapult us into the future, where we are global market leaders in much of the technology as well. So that's floating. And we also have next month our onshore event in Glasgow, which we also run together with Scottish Renewables. But we've also got a couple of new events this year, and we do constantly evolve our event portfolio. So we held our first renewable hydrogen event, which we did at ITM Power's Gigafactory in Sheffield, which was fantastic. We were blown away by the demand for it, and it just shows you how significantly this technology is taking off. And we've also, building on the success of our global offshore wind event, we're introducing this year a global offshore wind awards dinner. So that will be taking place in October, and we've just closed our nominations. So we've got a great event coming up. We've got some. It's going to be a great night to celebrate the industry. So we're looking forward to that as well.
Great. And can you tell us a little bit more about the awards dinner? What is it? What's the purpose of it? How many nominations have you had? How many gongs are up?
I think we've got 14 different awards coming up. right across from covering innovation, to do with like talent and game changers within the industry, to do with diversity and inclusion, to do great project execution, just transition. We're really trying to showcase some of these important achievements of the industry. But it's also it's just going to be a fun night as well. So I think we've secured a fairly I don't want to give too much away, but we've secured a great presenter for the evening. And actually, we've got so much to celebrate in this sector. And the UK is a global leader. That it's just a good, it's pretty good idea to actually take a moment to celebrate it, and to do so in a pretty public way. We've I think perhaps been guilty in the past of just keeping our industry's successes a bit of a secret, and I'd like for us to perhaps sing about it a little bit more. Why not?
Absolutely, why not? And have fun while doing it too. Dan, I presume that there are tables to be had and sponsorship opportunities and so on. And I'm sure a lot of people listening to this podcast will be interested to find out
Yeah,
more. Where do they
absolutely.
go?
Absolutely, come. They can contact us at Renewable UK, and the person to talk to is Vicky Mant.
Yeah,
So Vicky Mant is our commercial director, and she'll be taking any inquiries for that.
superb. If I can just for a second, Dan, I'd like to think outside the UK because, of course, our industry is a global industry. How does Renewable UK interface with its counterparts around the world? What's the role there, and how does it work?
Well, I think it's kind of a symbiotic thing. We renewables is a global industry, and the capital that flows into renewables is global capital. And many of the companies that we work with, if they're not what you would call a global company, they're certainly international companies. And therefore acting internationally is an important aspect of what we do. But it's also important to support UK companies from an export perspective and growing the profile of UK industry. In that, I went to the Offshore Wind event in Atlantic City, run by our colleagues Business Network Offshore Wind. And that was a similarly big event. I mean, to put it in context, there are only 7 wind turbines installed in the sea in America at the moment, but the pipeline is huge. The demand is massive, and since the Biden administration has come in, there's been a real, a big bet put on offshore wind as part of America's decarbonisation strategy, and this is playing out at a state level. But what was struck me is the amount of British voices that were there at that event. We really are, in many respects, the thought leaders and the early movers in this sector. So, we have a job as a trade body representing UK companies and UK supply chain in particular to outreach. So we take a trade mission. We took 12 companies to that particular event. I'm supporting next month an inbound delegation from Taiwan. I'm also supporting an inbound delegation from California. And this is all with a view to sort of help people learn lessons from the UK that help them build their wind strategies for their country, but also for us to position as technology leaders in the areas that we are, and help UK companies grow. So that's an important aspect. In COP26, we worked very closely with the Global Wind Energy Council. I know you've interviewed Ben Backwell on this, and we worked very well with GWEC on that. And recently I was elected to the board of Wind Europe. And I think even though, we've left the European Union, because of topics such as interconnection, topics such as the sustainability of the European supply chain, and the need for work collaboratively on innovation, I think our connection with European counterparts is hugely important. So I'll be working with my colleagues in Wind Europe, and continue to do so with GWEC in future, to work really in a global fashion, because this is in the end a global industry.
Great. It's good to hear all this is going on in the background as well, of course. Now, Dan, you mentioned pathways for people earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you can just take us through your own career and how your own pathway led you to becoming chief exec of Renewable UK.
I suppose if you'd have asked me when I was at university whether I'd be here when I'm, in my 40s, I probably would have been quite surprised, because my education, and I hope in many respects, my journey shows that you don't need to decide too early in life what you want to do when you grow up, right? I went to university and studied business, and I studied Spanish, and I spent a year studying in Spain, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I left university, except that I wanted to work in industry, and so I joined Siemens, the German technology company, as an apprentice. Not apprentice is the wrong word, a graduate trainee, and I trained in the commercial world, so working on project management of substation projects and the transmission part of the business at the time. But I knew I didn't want to sort of be working in finance, as it were. I wanted to work in sort of strategic leadership and grow my career in general management. And working in a big company like that is a great way to sort of define your own pathway. Siemens, as it was at that time, was a company which was very integrated. You could go and work in trains or healthcare or industrial automation or in power generation, and I ended up finding power generation particularly interesting. And after a number of sort of business development roles and marketing type roles, I was asked to help the wind power business, which Siemens had acquired in 2004. And this was in 2009, to help them define a strategy for manufacturing their next generation of offshore wind turbines. And offshore wind was really taking off at that particular moment in time in the UK. The UK was the biggest market for Siemens for offshore wind turbines, and I got involved in trying to work out where to locate a factory, and at that point I went to Denmark for 2 years. I worked over there to sort of develop the strategy, and then I spent another 2 years trying to close the deal, and the factory that is now the blade factory in Hull was my baby for more or less 5 years, taking it from concept through to investment decision. And then I worked in some big power generation. So I was moved into the thermal part of the business. I ran the UK thermal business in Siemens, and then I ran a global business based in Spain for a number of years. And then, but there was no question to me that the most exciting part of my career had been in renewables. And so when when the opportunity came up to come and lead the Renewable UK team, but ultimately take a role in shaping the future of renewables in the UK and trying to put my own fingerprints on the energy transition, I couldn't turn that down. It was such a great opportunity to try and use my insights and my experiences and hopefully my passion and commitment for the industry to try and shape the future and work together with government, which I'd done extensively when I was involved in the whole project, to try and do more like it and see more hulls and see more investment, innovation, and more people employed across the industry. So that was really my motivation. That's how I ended up here. Really, really diverse career, even though I only worked for one company before this point, because a company like Siemens isn't just one company. It's many different cultures within a huge melting pot, and that was really defining for me. And I loved it. In some ways I miss it, but at the same time I just love what I do, doing what I do now, which is a real privilege, frankly.
Great. And here in the UK, there's a contest ongoing just now to find out who's going to be our next Prime Minister. If your career was going to take you from trying to influence government to leading it, and Dan McGrial was our new Prime Minister, what would you do? What would be your priorities?
It's probably pretty daunting thought for some people. Look, I think given where we are now, I mean, I was reading the paper yesterday, and inflation has hit 10.1% in this country, and that is inextricably linked from energy. Absolutely inextricably linked. And I think, without getting into all sorts of different areas of policy that I'm sure I would have an opinion on, staying within my field, I'd have to point to the fact that the cost of living crisis and the energy security issues and net zero are all inextricably linked. And we are in this I don't know, this negative feedback loop where we're affecting the climate, and the climate is affecting our markets and our energy bills, and the demand for fossil fuel is determining our economy. And I would look to break that negative feedback loop. And the way to do that is to double down on net zero. I talked about the trilemma before, but if I go back a decade, the reason why we talked about the trilemma is because renewables are expensive. We knew we needed them because we wanted to reduce carbon emissions. So, we had to have other solutions for low cost, and then we had to take care of security of supply in that equation. Well, we're now in a situation where, net zero is not only low cost and the lowest cost of all types of generation, it's also the most secure because we don't depend on anyone else for our wind or our sun, and it's also the most sustainable option. So, really doubling down on the commitments to net zero does two things. One, it helps secure to build a sustainable pathway beyond this current cost of living crisis, but it also creates a better economic future because it is undoubtedly a huge area for growth. And in offshore wind alone, and I stress offshore wind alone, then we think we need to employ about 100,000 people by 2030, directly and indirectly. But that doesn't include many of the sort of the knock-on effects of that industry. But you think about electric vehicles, you think about solar, you think about insulation, you think about all of the different things that come with a strong and committed endeavor towards net zero, and then adding the networks. There's a huge economic opportunity that comes out of this, and it's sustainable, and it's a pathway beyond inflationary cycles. Who can predict when the next spike in gas will come? Everyone's curve at the moment shows gas prices high at the moment and then coming down in the future. Well, that's a curve based on hope. We need a pathway which is based on things we can control, and that's why I think if I were Prime Minister and coming into number 10 at the moment, it would be double down on net zero and break the negative feedback loop between climate and cost and economy.
Fantastic, Dan. You've got my vote. Dan, how do you define success for Renewable UK?
Well, look, I think the easiest way to define success is our progress towards net zero. We have a country which has been a pioneer. I mean, I'm really proud of the fact that the UK has shown such a strong and energetic pathway towards growing renewable industries, and seeing that industry being vibrant, diverse, but crucially sustainable, is really, for me, during my time in Renewable UK, what I want to achieve. I want to see us make progress towards net zero, and that the Committee on Climate Change will tell us whether we're doing a good job on that. But the outcome for me that really defines success is whether our industry is sustainable. And frankly, we've got to a point now where the industry has built its success up to now on a market environment and in a policy environment which has been all designed about getting the costs down. And we have to get to the point where we have to acknowledge the fact that we are now at a point where, and the recent CFD auction cleared at £37.25, which is, way below the long run prices of wholesale electricity. I think we've reached a point now where we can say the cost reduction is pretty much under control. And I think we need now to move towards sustainability of the industry. And that sustainability, I mean, is everyone making a healthy return? Are they investing in the communities that they are serving? Are they creating long-term jobs? And are they investing in their own sustainability? And for that, they need to be able to make healthy returns. And that's not just developers, but it's crucially the supply chain. And we can see the European supply chain and the turbine manufacturing supply chain perhaps as a bellwether for this. as being, under huge financial duress, which in many respects is counterintuitive. You would think in this huge moment of growth that turbine manufacturers would be doing really fantastically well. Well, they're not. And that, arguably is an early indicator as to what is happening in the rest of the supply chain. So, I want this industry to be sustainable, to be profitable, but, not excessively. And I want it to be, to have a long run health, to have long-term health that sets it on the pathway to be in, that crucial role, or playing that crucial role in net zero. So for me, that's kind of what I hope to achieve.
Hey, thanks, Dan. And if I can, I'd like to leave just on a personal question, essentially. We know how you define success for Renewable UK, Dan, but how do you define success for yourself personally?
If you haven't picked it up by now, I have a certain Merseyside twang in my accent. I come from I come from the Wirral. My family were all from North Liverpool, and I grew up in the 1980s in Liverpool. And anyone who's followed the history of that city would know that it was a pretty challenging time. And I look at the way my city, and I'm talking about Liverpool as an example rather than being my specific motivation. I look at how things have evolved, and the economy has evolved much more positive now than it was in the 1980s. But it still lacks high value, well-paid jobs for people to stay in the community that they're from. And I think this happens a lot in our country. It happens in, the Northeast, happens in Yorkshire, happens across Scotland, where, if you want to earn a decent career, a decent amount of money, if you want to have a career pathway, then often the pressure is on you to leave and go somewhere else. And I went through that experience. I lived in the Southeast, as many other people will do. I mean, I'm very happy and proud to live back in Liverpool now. But for me, one of my fundamental, and all of that is about the fact that I'm motivated significantly by social mobility and social justice. And I believe that is, and as I've already said, I think that's very, very closely linked with climate justice at a wider scale. And therefore, for me, what I want to do in my career, and what I want to be able to look back on when I retire is, what was I able to do things in my time which helped social mobility and social justice. And I think renewables is a great lever for that. As I've already mentioned, nothing gave me a bigger buzz than being able to turn up to the opening day of a factory in Hull, which, I had a blank PowerPoint slide at some point in 2009, and then I helped craft and shaped, and I didn't do it on my own. I worked with a huge team of really talented people to do it, but to be able to shape that, to see that value flowing into Hull, and to see young people, young women, people coming from long-term unemployment, people with disabilities, etc., to see them getting jobs and careers and prospects and opportunities to develop into long-term careers in their own city is a buzz that, frankly, keeps me motivated all the time now. So that's what I want to move the dial on. I want to do more of that. And I think renewables is well, there's no better place to do it, frankly.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. Look, thank you very much, Dan, for joining me today. That does bring us to the end of our podcast. So on behalf of OGV Media Group, Anet Consulting, and me personally, Dan, thank you, Dan McGrial, Chief Executive Officer of Renewable UK, for joining us. As always, everyone, feedback on today's podcast would be welcome. Equally, suggestions of who you'd like us to feature in the future would be great. Feel free to get in touch. LinkedIn's good, so's email. It's Murray, Moray, at anetconsulting.com. It'd be great to hear from you. Thank you very much, and we'll speak to you next time.